Okay, let's try and take this step by step. Theorists in the Middle Ages described allegory as a kind of continued metaphor. That definition is a lot more helpful than it looks. To make sense of it, we need first to ask ourselves how a metaphor works. We can think of a metaphor as having two parts. The vehicle is the thing we are actually talking about. The tenor is the thing we really mean. So we've all come across poems that are about love, but they don't use that word. Instead, they talk about Cupid or Cupid's arrow. Cupid is the vehicle of a metaphor about love. Allegory is a continued metaphor because, as well as using one thing to talk about something else, we also add a story, a narrative. The characters in our story will often be metaphors. They are allegorical vehicles helping to demonstrate the metaphor. And the plot will not be designed around what might really happen, as in fiction. Instead, it will explore the nature of the ideas. And the description of places and people will also serve the metaphorical needs of the story. So, for example, in the Fairy Queen Book 2, our hero is Sir Guyon, the Knight of Temperance. He represents a man trying to develop self-control, so his youth is emphasised. He's still learning. In one episode, we find him in the cave of Mammon. Mammon's name comes from the Bible, and he represents worldly riches. With Mammon in the cave is the figure of death. The point of having death there is a metaphor. It suggests that death accompanies greed. If we are greedy, it will lead to moral and physical death. Guyon is tempted by Mammon, but he doesn't give in. That tells us that a temperate man controls his desire for money. Not every aspect of an allegorical narrative will be metaphorical in this way. Learning to read allegory is really about learning to recognise the clues the author gives us about which things are metaphors and which things aren't. So what kind of clues do we get? Well, if something doesn't make sense in the story, if it breaks the normal conventions of the genre, that's often a clue to read the passage in a different way. Names are always a good clue. Their meaning in another language often reveals their allegorical reference, especially if they're borrowed from a famous character in the Bible or mythology. So Acrasia's name means lacking self-control, and so her name identifies the moral failing that she represents. Descriptions, particularly of places, can be allegorical too. They can seem odd, and that oddness is a hint to look for a metaphorical meaning, to look for allegory. So the house of Alma, for example, is generally described as being well built, but it's made of mud, not brick or stone. This is in order to give us a hint that it represents the human body, the house of the soul. There are different kinds of allegorical characters. There are personifications, abstract principles represented in a character, or archetypes representing different kinds of people, as well as mythological characters. And there are levels of allegory. There are some characters who are complex because they are allegorical figures in different ways in more than one place. They operate metaphorically in different ways at different points of the story. So the figure of Prince Arthur in The Fairy Queen. Arthur is the eponymous hero of the Arthurian romances and was very familiar to Spenser's readers, but he also represents greatness of spirit and therefore the English monarchy. Allegory is a deliberately puzzling way of writing. These are texts that want you to work at finding the meaning, and that may take time. A good edition will be your best friend.